In the past I've talked a bit about Nik and also about Nik Color Efex. These two filters are very useful, but they appear to cause quite a lot of confusion about how to use them and when to use them. We've said Viveza, for example, is all about shadows, highlights and colour, whilst Color Efex is really about applying special effects to your images. Well, this is all very true, but there are some of the filters in Color Efex that actually allow you to do some very quick fixes to landscape images without having to do a lot of work. These filters are pretty much essential and I use them quite a lot in my own work. What I'd like to do today is share some of the filters with you, and we'll actually take a look at the very first one and possibly the most important one that I use on virtually all my images. To do this, I'm going to show you an example image. You can see it on the screen here in Lightroom. I shot this back in 2006, so it's around 10 years old. At the time I was with a pro photographer on a course, and it was suggested to us that we should be using filters. So I was duly obliging, putting a very strong 81EF filter onto the front of my image in the hope to emphasize the sunset you can see. Really, I didn't need this, and as you can see, it's ended up colouring the image quite strongly. What I can do is I can try to correct this in Lightroom, and in fact if I move the custom white balance to a quite cool temperature and I adjust some of the pink and remove that over to the green in the tint, I get a little bit of a better colour in the image. Now that's fine, but it still may not be as good as I can get this. So let's take this now into Nik Color Efex and I'll show you some of the tips and tricks you can use to actually improve this image. To open the image from Lightroom into Color Efex, I just right click on the image and I can now select Color Efex Pro. The image I've been editing here is a raw image, so I have to open a copy of it with Lightroom adjustments, and I'm going to open it as a TIFF file for maximum quality, and I'm going to change the colour space from sRGB, because that's quite a small colour space, to Adobe RGB, which is much better for editing in. I've got the bit depth set to 16 bits, the other option is 8 bits, and the resolution is set to 360, which is optimum for the printer that I use. So now I can click edit and the image gets converted with the adjustments we've applied, and it will now be opened in Color Efex. Here we are now in Color Efex Pro. If you're not familiar with the Color Efex Pro, it's a fairly simple layout. Over here on the left we have a number of filters that we can apply to the image. The image is previewed in the center, and over on the right you can actually see the filters themselves and the controls they offer. So if I select one of these filters over here, then you apply the effect and the various changes are over here. They usually default to whatever settings are predefined over here. Now what you can do as well is also filter these filters into the groupings that Nik have created. So at the moment I have this set to all, and if I click landscape, these are the filters that Nik believe are best suited for landscape work. You will find that some of the filters appear in multiple places. So for example, in nature you've got Pro Contrast, and in landscape you've also got Pro Contrast. Now the Pro Contrast filter is one that I think is absolutely essential for landscape work, and it's extremely useful. Here it is over on the right now, and we've got three options that we can use with Pro Contrast. And the first one is correct color cast. So some images actually display a color cast, and changing the contrast will actually make it appear worse. So a very good option is to be able to correct that. We then have correct contrast, which will reintroduce any contrast into low contrast images. And then we've got something called dynamic contrast, which effectively is mid-tone contrast, but I'll demonstrate that shortly using the histogram down here. So the first thing I want to do is correct the color cast, because this image, even though we corrected it in Lightroom, still has quite a pink orangey tint to it. So all I have to do is slide the correction over to the right. Now if I slide it all the way, I actually remove all the color out of the image completely, and because this is quite a vivid sunset, there was quite a strong cast to the light anyway. So really what I need to do is just move it in a little way to correct it and make the stones appear more natural, but still leave the colour in the sky and the colour in the boats. So that's the first adjustment I'm going to do. Now I could actually go and correct the contrast and correct the dynamic contrast using the same filter, but I'm not going to. Instead, I'm going to add a new filter, and I'm going to add another Pro contrast filter. Now with the second Pro contrast filter open, I can start to apply some contrast adjustments to the boats and possibly to the sky as well. So I'm going to do this now with a control point. So the first thing I want to do is add a control point to the image here, and now I'm going to use some dynamic contrast so that that is being applied directly to the boat. Now that's quite useful, but we also could do with applying some more contrast to the sky. So if I add another filter, you can see that's being added as well. And also at this point I might correct the contrast, so I can add in additional contrast into those areas. If I expand the control points here and just turn those on, you can see that the selection's being made to the sky and to the boats. So that's adding the contrast into those areas. Notice this opacity slider here. That's controlling where we add the contrast to the rest of the image. So what we could do is, if we move that over to the right, you'll notice that the image gets a little bit lighter in those areas. So the white areas are where we're adding maximum contrast, the dark areas are where we're adding the least contrast. So as we move this opacity slider over to the right, the whole image goes white. That means the contrast being applied to everywhere. If we move it over to the left, areas are going back to black, so there's no adjustment apart from the areas we selected with the control points. That's quite important for understanding how this is working and the adjustments being applied. So let's apply a small amount of dynamic contrast to everywhere and contrast adjustment, and that looks to be about right. The other thing that we can actually do with this filter now is we can actually add in another Pro contrast, because I just want to show you this. If we now shift the dynamic contrast, look what happens to the image. So rather than pushing out the histogram to both sides and clipping everything, it actually adds contrast into the mid-tone here in the histogram, and it tends to open up the shadows a little bit. So if I move that over to the left, you can see that the shadow areas here become darker. Move it over to the right and it actually opens them up. So there's a lot of control that you can achieve with this contrast filter. Now I'll just remove that one, because we've got the two Pro contrast filters here already. One is covering the color cast reduction, so that looks to be about right now, and the other one is controlling how we add contrast into the boat and also into the sky. You can also use these controls here, shadow and highlight, to control where the adjustment is being applied. So by moving this over to the right, we actually prevent the adjustment being applied to the shadows, and as we And this one here, if we move the highlights over to the right, we actually prevent the adjustment being applied to the highlights. Now as I was doing that, you should notice the histogram down here is actually being corrected. When it's over here, it's clipping because the bright areas of orange and red are really just off to the maximum levels. But if I move it in, I actually recover some of that colour. Okay, so that is the Color Efex Pro contrast filter, and it applies some of the best corrections that you can achieve for landscape images. Very quick, very easy to use, and it's a great tool if you shoot a lot of landscapes, especially at sunset time. Next time I'm going to show you another of the filters that I think is absolutely essential for landscape photography.